I'm Beverly Lindsay, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here this afternoon for this presidential session entitled From Classrooms to Outer Space via Public Policies, Renowned Intellectuals and Leaders Articulate Opportunities and Challenges in STEM and Related Fields. This presidential session builds upon our experiences through various federal grants, philanthropic grants, and the positions that some of our very eminent speakers have held. As a number of you may very well be aware, the number of underrepresented students in graduate and postgraduate programs in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, are quite small. Interestingly enough, however, the percentages, while small, the actual percentages of underrepresented students in England is higher. In the United States, for example, African Americans and Hispanic Americans complete less than 6% of PhDs in STEM or in the STEM education field. The numbers are very small also in England. However, in some institutions, 25% of the students will be underrepresented, referred to as BME, Black and Minority Ethnics. STEM is defined a bit more broadly in England, in the United Kingdom, than in the United States. However, the issues are somewhat similar in both areas. And on our panel today, we have incredibly distinguished people. This will be in an interactive mode. We have, to my left, Professor Sylvester James Jim Gates, who is a Regents Professor, only the 9th one in the history of the University of Maryland. He is also a National Medal of Science recipient and an advisory council, the Science and Advisory Council to President Barack Obama. He is a physicist. To my immediate right is Professor Michael Jonathan Rice, who is the immediate former, we would say in the American system, Vice President for Research at the Institute of Education, which is now University College London and the Institute of Education. He is well known in terms of his work in STEM and preparing teachers and future educators in the field, and he is an advisor to the Education Committee of the British Parliament. To my far right is Dr. Shirley Malcolm. She is a pioneer in the field of environmental sciences and ecology. Not only a pioneer in the field, but in terms of women who have been involved continually for 3 or more decades in STEM fields. She has represented the United States on UN, United Nations, international commissions. She is on the board of trustees for Caltech and also Morgan State University, and she is the vice president for education at the American Association for the Advancement of Science. So as you can see, we have a very, very distinguished panel. What I will be doing initially is asking each of the panelists a similar question. They will take 2, 3, maybe 4 minutes to respond. We have a series of these, and then we would very much welcome your audience questions and participation. So with that, I will start with the very first question, and that is, each of you has had a very distinguished career in the United States and/or in the United Kingdom. What are the 2 or 3 public schools and/or undergraduate education that contributed to your study and your subsequent career in a STEM field? Jim?
Thank you for that introduction, Beverly. And I beg the forgiveness of the audience. I've created a small waterfall up here. I hope you enjoyed the special effect. So to answer the question in my case, it actually starts, of course, before school. It starts with my parents. And my parents supported my very precocious interest in science starting at age 4 and all through my childhood. But to focus in on the question, I spent all of my high school years in Orlando, Florida, and the school systems were effectively segregated then. So all of my teachers were fellow African Americans, all of my fellow students were African Americans. And this was in a historically significant high school in Orlando called Jones High. So I attended there from 1963 to 1969. And it was a wonderful place. We had extraordinary teachers because one of the perverse effects of segregation is that it limited very, very highly competent people to be in the role of teachers. And so, for example, my physics teacher actually had a bachelor's in physics, and that's extremely rare in the country right now for most students. So that was the foundation of my education. Then I went off to what had been my 14-year-old dream of a college, went off to MIT, did 4 years there, earned a bachelor's, 2 bachelors actually, and that's an accident. Stayed there for graduate school for another 4 years, PhD in physics, and then off to Harvard for 3 years for postgraduate study, followed by Caltech. So you can see that it's a sort of unusual pedigree going from a segregated Southern black school in the 60s to then MIT, Harvard, and Caltech.
Thank you. Michael?
Colleagues, good to be here, and I hope you'll excuse me standing. I've got rather bad sciatica, so it's just more comfortable if I do. A bit like Jim, I was thinking that, to be honest, the crucial thing for me was my family. My mother was a nurse. My father was a doctor, but he always said he didn't like sciences and was hopeless at mathematics. But my mother was rather good at mathematics, and she taught me my times tables and so on before I went to school. And it's difficult to be sure, but I always felt that gave me phenomenal confidence. And I can remember an occasion when I was about 6 or 7 years old, and I had missed a couple of weeks just because of some routine childhood illness. And a rather nice our teacher of all subjects, saying to me, and I can remember her worried look on her face, that we'd started multiplication, and with sort of lofty disdain, I was able to say, "That's quite all right. My mother has taught me that." And certainly by the time I was 7 or so, I always was thought within the family that I was going to be a scientist. I was the sort of rather geeky child who found the Bohr model of the atom extremely attractive. I was terribly fortunate when I was 19 that somebody stood on tiptoes and kissed me, and I realized she was quite attractive as well. But until that, to be honest, I was just one of these very introverted, mathematicsy, sciencey geeks. I wasn't taught very well at school until I went to a school at the age of 13. Wasn't taught very well in terms of maths and science, but it didn't matter. And then I had a really good teachers from the age of 13, and it was just obvious to everybody, including me, that I was going to study university science.
Thank you, Michael. Shirley?
I would say that my experience parallels Jim's quite a bit in the sense of having kind of strong family interest in education from the beginning, and also going to segregated schools. But in addition, I had the fact of going to segregated schools in Birmingham, Alabama. Those of you who understand or have learned anything about the history or heard anything about the 50-year celebrations that we have had over time can kind of get a sense about what doing this in Birmingham would be like. I was one of those post-Sputnik kids. When Sputnik happened, I was in grade school, and I happened to have a science teacher who nurtured that interest that all the students had in the whole Sputnik event. I think that one of the things that is quite clear is that while there may have been the messages from the larger society in Alabama that we may not have been worth investing the resources in terms of our education, that was not the case in our intimate society, and that is our families, our communities, our church communities, wherever, where we were and our teachers, where we were getting totally different kinds of messaging that essentially said, you've got to show them. I mean, you basically are confronting a lot more than you realize. There's a civil rights struggle that is also in play here. When I left the South to go to my undergraduate training at the University of Washington in Seattle, it was so very different from the place that I had left. And it was one of those cases of where I went there as a pre-med major, thinking that that was all I basically knew that you could do with science at the time. But over time, as I became invested and embedded in a community of science, I really began to see a lot more opportunities. And I think that it was those undergraduate opportunities that said that all things were possible within the sciences.
Thank you very much, Shirley. The second question that each of our participants will be responding to is, each of them has specialized in 2 or 3 fields of science. And I must admit I'm a social scientist, but they explain to me in a layperson's term exactly what their fields are. So they will do that briefly, and also why they decided to focus on these fields of science. Jim?
Thank you. Well, I often tell people I had no choice, quite frankly. When I was 4 years old, my mother took me to see a movie about rockets and space travel. It may well have been the first movie I ever saw in life, and now at age 64, I still carry pictures of that movie in my memory. About a decade ago, I started to use the web to try to track the movie down, and I eventually found it. It's a movie called Spaceways, a typical science fiction movie, actually produced in England, not in the US. And it answered a question for me, which was, why did my mother take me to see this movie? My mother was artistic in her temperament. She crocheted, she fired clay figurines, she did some painting, and so I had always wondered why I wound up in this movie. When I tracked the movie down, it became pretty obvious because the star of the movie was a gentleman by the name of Howard Duff. Howard Duff, for a while, was married to Ida Lupino, and Ida Lupino was one of my mother's 2 favorite actresses. So I tell people Ida Lupino got me into science. So in our family, we have a sort of a strange history with regard to mathematics. My grandfather could neither read nor write, but he could do simple arithmetic, which made him of very great value in the community in which he lived, which is near Mendon, Alabama in the early 1900s. Because he could do arithmetic, he could sort of be the honest broker when disagreements on accounts came up between store owners and the black farmers in the community. So we've always in the family had this really interesting relationship with mathematics. My dad never finished high school, but I remember watching him study trigonometry and some calculus as he was earning his GED in his 27-year-long career. So I had no choice in some sense. I mean, there was always this natural affinity. And I always knew it was going to be science, especially after age 8. We were living in Texas at that time. Previously, when I went to this movie, it was actually in St. John's, Newfoundland. I don't know how many of your audience members have ever been there, but that's where I was. And Dad brought home some books on space travel. And I remembered this movie from 4 years earlier. And the 2 of them put together in my mind a question, which is, the books taught me that the lights in the sky are places. Since they're that small, how far away are they? And asking that one question actually is what sort of caused a mental big bang. And that together with my interest in science, that together with my interest in mathematics meant that I was always sort of bound to become a mathematical physicist. I guess the final thing that I would say is mathematics is an extraordinary, in fact, I'd like to call it the incomparable human language. Most people don't think of mathematics as a language, but it actually is. It shares all the attributes of languages, plus many attributes that other languages do not possess. And because I was very sensitive to this as a teenager, that mathematics was basically a construct in our imagination, I was thunderstruck in taking my first physics class and learning that the distance that an object rolls down an incline is dependent on the square of the time it takes. That's the only piece of magic I have ever seen in my life, because that's like a conjuration. It's like you write a spell and then suddenly it's there in reality. And because of that realization, I was like, that's definitely what I have to do with my life.
Thank you. Michael?
My school was an all-boys school, so we didn't do biology, but I did physics and chemistry as well as mathematics. and went up to university to read physics, and then very rapidly realized in the first 2 weeks that I wasn't really a physicist. This was the beginning of me broadening out. In England, luckily, the university I went to, it was effortless to shift, so I just shifted to biology. And then after the first degree in biology, I did a PhD in animal behavior of deer, with also quite a lot of mathematics, because it turned out I was reasonably good still at maths. And then I did a postdoc in applied maths. And this was back in 1982 by now, which is when in England we were going through a bit of a recession, so there weren't many jobs around. So I thought I'd do a teacher training course for a year, but carry on writing academic papers in science and applying for further postdocs in science. And suddenly realized 2/3 of the way through the teacher training course that I wanted a job as a school teacher. I admit this was partly because then I'd be able to get a mortgage, and I'd got married by now to the person who'd stood on tiptoe 5 years earlier. And I then had 5 years teaching in schools, assuming that would be the career for my rest of my life, and consider myself very fortunate that then I've become basically a social scientist subsequently.
Thank you. Shirley?
My own background at the University of Washington was in the field of zoology, and in particular that department was very strong in ecology. And so I think that I got kind of drawn into the whole area and ended up receiving my master's from UCLA in zoology, really looking at animal behavior, and my PhD in ecology from Penn State, focusing on ecology, evolutionary biology, and ethology. I think that I've always been fascinated by behavior. Behavior as an adaptation, as it were, to an uncertain environment. The genes are what they are. The behavior can be a lot of things. And so there's a larger set of questions about the interaction of genetics and experience and learning, and what happens to organisms after that time. And I think that those were the kinds of things that really drew my attention, and that I found really fascinating.
Thank you, Shirley. Thanks again, Shirley. I am going to reverse the order a bit in terms of how I've been asking the questions of our various professionals. Each of the members of our panel has advised Congress, the Prime Minister, Parliament, and/or the President of the United States. In this instance, I will begin with Michael, since he advises the education committees and others in England, and he's also been a senior administrator at the Royal Academy. Michael?
So the question is really about how does one do it?
What do you what are the positive conditions for faculty in STEM fields, and what are challenges and for students, and how have you disseminated or provided this information to Congress, to Parliament, the Prime Minister, the President, for example?
Got it, thanks. So in the United Kingdom, what you always find that ministers and senior civil servants want is, first of all, they want to be really sure that you are balanced. So, you know, I may be rather passionate about certain things in science and maths education, which we may or may not get onto, but my job is not just to push that line, it's to give them the main consensus within the field. Secondly, of course, you have got to speak absolutely jargon-free. I am, like probably all of us, you know, very capable of talking, you know, in a sort of Foucauldian language influenced by Deleuze or Bourdieu or whoever. That would not be a wise strategy. They are normal, intelligent, busy people. And thirdly, anything you write has got to be less than 2 pages and legible in terms of intelligibility within about, in my experience, 90 seconds, maybe 120 if you've built up a good relationship. And I think that's a perfectly fair demand from a politician. If we're not crystal clear about 2 or 3 things that the field is confident would move things forward, whether we're talking about for children in school, disadvantaged or in general, then I think we can expect politicians rightly to ignore us.
So what would you cite as one or two examples that you have presented recently to Parliament?
Okay, so the most obvious one in terms of STEM, I do a lot of work in sex education, though I have to say I'm rather less successful in getting my arguments in sex education accepted than I am in STEM education. Very briefly, when I first got on some of these reasonably senior committees, I remember asking senior civil servants, what are we doing in England to get more people to study subjects like physics and chemistry and maths after the age of 16? And they said, we're getting them to do better and better in their exams. And I said, but we've been getting better and better exam results year on year for 10 years, and the numbers doing physics and chemistry and maths have gone down the last 2 years. That's a correlation of minus 1.0. And they understood that. I don't know if nobody told them before. And so I then said, so it looks like there are different factors responsible for attainment and for choosing to study the subject once it becomes optional. And then we got into, so what makes students more likely to choose a subject once it's optional?
Thanks, Michael. I will make a couple of points of clarification because I know many of the audience members are from the United States and England's system of education with critical examinations at particular periods. Formerly, they had an 11+ exam, so literally students at 11 years old, we would say 6th grade, had a major exam, and that's been changed, which determines what kinds of tracks they could have in high school or secondary school. Then a secondary school exam, and if you did well enough, you had an additional 2 years, and then if you did well enough with honors level, what is called A levels, high scores in other words, then you could go to a reputable university. So their system was very stratified, and what Michael is saying, he is talking about what the effects are in STEM at different areas. Jim.
So the questions that you gave us were two, and I'll try to oscillate between them. The first question that you gave us in preparing for this panel was, what are the positive conditions for STEM, for faculty in STEM fields? And I think in our country, in the U.S., and I have a suspicion this is true around the world as I have spoken to policymakers and politicians in other countries, the biggest challenge that faculty face in STEM is to realize the new role that they have to play in economic empowerment for the sustainment of middle-class lifestyles. This is totally new as far as I can tell. Coming out of the Second World War, certainly in my discipline of physics, this country, and I think it was true in all countries, felt a great gratitude to the scientists for actually creating the weaponry that successfully allowed the democracies of this world to defend our way of life. And that went on for a couple of decades, that gratitude by unquestioning support for the sciences and engineering. But now we've entered a totally new era, a totally new milieu, in which the gateways to middle-class lifestyle in this country very clearly run through STEM. But they run through it in a very peculiar manner. In a number of our reports to President Obama over the course of the last 6 years, we've talked about this. The desire that we have for STEM access and attainment and achievement of students is not to produce more scientists and engineers principally. And that's something that a lot of people don't understand. They say, oh, you want more PhDs. Well, actually, no. As we have looked at the data, there's little to suggest that the country suffers from a lack of PhD level engineers, mathematicians, and scientists. But there is an enormous amount of data that suggests that what is going on is the restructuring of our economies, and this is being done in such a way that people with the skill set that we traditionally associate with STEM will have an economic advantage. Let me end this recitation, and because I want to hear my colleagues' take on this. Let me end this recitation by pointing out an article that appeared in the New York Times approximately 3 weeks ago. It was an article about the pathways to middle-class lifestyle that come through, in this country, through healthcare. And in the United States, we are seeing lots of changes. For example, the majority of students who attend universities in the United States are actually female, not male. And this has been true for about 10 years, although the country as a whole does not seem to realize this. But in the area of healthcare, and these are young women principally who do not go to university, in the area of healthcare, there are new systems coming online that allow people to earn a middle-class lifestyle. And one of the things that's really striking about the demographics is that far more women have taken advantage of this route to the middle class than men. So in this one story that appeared, there's a young lady who has retrained herself, has upgraded her skills so that she can do some of the modern information technology that goes on to support healthcare. And her husband, who had formerly had a job in a factory and had been laid off several times, made the attempt to do the same. He failed. Enrolled at a 2-year college, he failed, and his downfall was mathematics. That's what's new.
Thank you. Shirley?
Yes, I served on the President's Committee during the Clinton administration, and at the same time, I was a member of the National Science Board, which was the policymaking body of the National Science Foundation. And one of the things that I noted, because midway through the Clinton administration, the party leadership in the House of Representatives shifted from Democrat to Republican. And so, on the one hand, you had go into meetings with President Clinton or Vice President Gore, and then you turn around and you go into meetings with Speaker Gingrich. And the thing that was really fascinating about that was that there was no disagreement about the importance of science or the importance of the support for basic research. The interesting part was that there was bipartisan support for the idea that science was really an important element that had to be supported. And if you find right now, you will still find bipartisan support for the idea that we have to have skilled people who have STEM skills. And that there is general agreement around that particular aspect. I think that is a really positive thing for STEM faculty. The negative thing is that support is not passionate support. There's passionate support for some other things. There's general support for the idea of investing in those areas. And I think that Jim is really right, that if you are concerned about the economy of the future, you have to be concerned about not only having the STEM knowledge, but also the skilled workforce. And you have to support innovation and invention and the kinds of things that we're going to need in order to solve the nation's problems. I just want to mention one final element. During the Clinton PCAST years, this was the boom years for the internet and the whole notion about the role that IT might actually have in terms of supporting education. And there was a strong interest in looking more deeply at this. And I served on the education committee within PCAST. And one of the things that became quite clear was that our research base to inform what we needed to do was really sorely lacking. There was so much we didn't understand about what to do about education and how to smartly apply technology as a support to help improve education. And so out of that came the Interagency Education Research Initiative that led to the infusion of resources within a number of the agencies, including IES, within the Department of Education. So there is this system whereby input is provided and there is response on the part of the administration to the input that is provided.
Thank you, Shirley. Michael, would you care to comment a bit further in terms of what Shirley and Jim have stated in terms of the economic and the middle class lifestyles, particularly in England? And as you know, I've spent considerable time there since 2011 and come back and forth between the United States and England and can compare those. And you and I have had conversations on this. So would you like to speak to that issue briefly?
I very strongly support what Jim says. The shortage is not doctoral level pure scientists. enough people who do get to undergraduate level really fall in love with science and just want to do a doctorate and want to be an academic scientist. It's the general skill level in the population. We, for example, in the United Kingdom, score extraordinarily poorly, worse than the US, for example, by a long way, on how our productivity improves in industry over the years. And that gets tracked back quite often to too many young people when they leave school not being comfortable with, good at mathematics and also basic literacy. And the trouble with the UK is that most politicians come, as I admit I do, from basically privileged backgrounds, so they know a lot about the top 30% or so academically of students. They don't know enough about the full 95 to 100%. And so our education policies, generation after generation, are not geared towards the full spread of students.
Thank you, Michael. And if I might add a few other comments, Michael and I have been the principal investigator and co-PI on a National Science Foundation grant. And one of the issues that we are looking at, our conceptual framework deals with the intersectionality of race, gender, and class. However, in our NSF proposal, we changed the order of that to make it gender, class, and race. Why? Because more women are in universities in the United States and in the United Kingdom. But secondly, in the case of England, the class distinctions are still so pronounced. Michael just stated a few minutes ago that he came from a privileged background, and there's discussion, considerable amount now in England, about blacks and poor white boys not being able to participate in education. So gender is there, but at the same time, there's a real discussion and policies being discussed about class issues.
I don't want to tease too much, but you probably know, those of you who are quantitative, that if you do quantitative measures of the importance of parental income on student attainment, the US, UK, Brazil, a number of other countries, we're the worst in the world. I mean, the best ones are the Scandinavian countries, the Netherlands, and a number of other countries. But our two nations are amongst the most inequitable in terms of translation of parental family income into child academic success.
So we will now move to the next question, and we'll start this time with Shirley. Several of your examples from the last one in terms of relationships to faculty and relationships to the economy, which both of you mentioned, or all three of you mentioned, but could you give a few more examples with reference to your specific areas?
Well, that's pretty easy. We look right now, for example, at climate change, and we see stressors on the environment and the changes that are happening within ecosystems, and many of those changes actually affecting health outcomes. I think that those are some of the really, really clear cases of also seeing loss of species with the alteration of climate. And I think that as the debate goes on, the climate change discussion can begin to sound rather fractured, but I think that in part it is because we, and that's the larger we, are not very clear in our communications about climate and about really making it about the individual. It's not just about what is the long-term outlook for the planet. It's also about the short-term outlook for your family, for your health, for your economy. And I think that as we become clearer in talking about these issues, then we can probably build more public understanding as we really need.
Thank you. Michael?
Well, I'll actually just follow up on the point about climate change because it's very relevant to the UK as well. And as I said, my background's in animal behavior and population genetics, and I'm the co-author of a fairly standard undergraduate textbook in ecology. So as an individual, I'm as sure as one can be that a high proportion of climate change at the moment is anthropogenic. But I don't want assessment systems in schools that mean you can't get full marks if you as a student don't accept climate change. In other words, if you come from a background, a family background, and you cheerfully say, well, my dad and my mum doesn't believe it, and I don't believe it either, I want an assessment system which rewards not whether or not you believe in climate change, but whether you can interrogate the data, whether you know something about interdisciplinarity. We're only talking about 16-year-olds. These are not the individuals who are yet making the political decisions. And what I don't want to do is I don't want to turn them off science, and I don't want to have them sort of sitting there mentally thinking, crumbs, he's just trying to persuade me climate change has occurred. For me, the whole point about science is precisely that, to a certain extent, eventually, the data speak for themselves. And our job is to get students to be good at gathering and interrogating and interpreting data.
Thank you. Jim?
Well, my colleagues have laid out what I think is in fact the preeminent challenge that our species will face in the next several decades, which for us scientists is climate change. I know in the general public here in the US, this is still considered controversial, but we scientists look at our colleagues who are experts in the area, and if you had 100 of them in the room, 97 of them, according to recent surveys I've seen, 97 out of 100 would say, yes, humans are the source of climate change, and they can give you reasons why. So climate change is an enormous challenge, but the next big challenge I can see 50 or 100 years down the road is sustainable energy production, because we are now, I think, close somewhere between 7 and 9 billion souls on this planet, and the American style of life apparently is extremely attractive to people around the world. One example of that is the recent creation of a genuine middle class in China. China has lifted more people out of poverty and into a middle class lifestyle than any country has ever done in the history of the planet, more rapidly than any country has ever done it in history. And so I think that's a testament that this is an attractive lifestyle for people. But this is a very intensive, energy-intensive lifestyle. And so we're going to have to face that. Water production, food security, all of these are issues that, although they may not have been the primary focus of science in the last 50 years, unless we scientists and those who support scientists face these problems, our species is going to be under severe stress in the next 100 years. So there's an agenda that's being set by the sheer number of us, humans, who occupy this planet. And as many of us believe science should be the servant to and a pathway to a bountiful life, I think that's going to set priorities for what science should be doing.
Thanks, Jim. The next question comes from popular television, and it's often asked on C-SPAN and on CBS Sunday Morning. Each of our presenters is a very senior person and world-renowned in their field. But let's say they were 18 to 20 years of age now, and they were advising their younger self. What would this advice be? To them or to your younger self, what would you share? And how would you use this information to your younger self to increase the number of underrepresented university students in the U.S., meaning African Americans, Hispanic Americans, for example, women, and in the United Kingdom, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, African Caribbean, British Caribbean, African descent from various parts of Africa? What would you tell your younger self? Jim?
That's a really interesting question, and of the questions that you sent, I found this one the most challenging. There are two aspects of this advising one's younger self. One is how one would try to position that younger self to achieve what we have achieved, but with a lower stress level. I think that would be a very important set of advice. But the question really was, you phrased this question in a context of change in society, change particularly in academia and
Yes.
STEM academia. And the truth of the matter is, I thought about it as you had sent the question out, and there's nothing that I would have told a younger me about this particular problem, because I was kind of a cynical kid. I was like Michael. He talked about being a kind of a geeky kid. I was kind of that too. And because of that, I was also very much a people watcher, which is rather rare in introverted personalities, that they actually watch other people. And so I had formulated theories about how people thought and acted. And for me, the unfortunate thing is that in this particular domain, most of what I thought at 18 and 19 and 20 years old, I still believe is valid. And so there's nothing I could have told that young person because he was cynical.
Okay. Michael, were you cynical also?
No, and I'm very impressed with Jim at the age of 18 to 20 because I did not observe other people. I was living in a world of my own. I was very fortunate. I mean, things worked out fine. I think the honest answer, which I'd try and give, because it's a complicated and important question you've asked us, Beverly, for somebody from a background where they are less likely to end up straightforwardly where they would like to be, I think what I'd try and say is a mixture of, you're always going to have to try and swim upstream. You're just going to have to. The system is not going to improve fast enough, but people do succeed in swimming upstream, sometimes by their own efforts, sometimes with support from others, and it's very rare nowadays, certainly in England, that there comes a point where the future you are hoping for is impossible. We have a very stratified, a bit like you, if I may say so, in the States, a very stratified higher education system, as you alluded to, Beverly, in your introductory remarks. That has problems, but it, funnily enough, has certain advantages because it does mean you get to some higher education if you want to. And the English and UK tradition is the great majority of higher education institutions teach quite a good range of subjects. They don't all do, becoming a vet or something like that, but a lot of them do, for example, STEM disciplines. So, as I say, push hard, swim upstream, get support from others, have a plan B and a plan C and a plan D.
Thank you. Shirley?
That was a fascinating question. And I have a story that I have to tell you that begins to answer it. I was at a conference that we were running for largely minority students who were presenting their research. Jim has actually spoken at that conference, the Emerging Researchers National Conference. And I met these three young men from my hometown who were at a community college, and they were taking it in. They weren't presenting research, they were listening to the other students present research. And I asked them where they lived, and one young man had lived maybe about 3 miles from where I was born and raised in another section. And I said, well, I was born and raised in Collegeville, and anybody who knows Birmingham and knows Collegeville, the young man's next comment makes sense. He said, from Collegeville to here? And I realized that for him, this was a kind of a statement that you have to be open to possibilities. I spent most of my life swimming upstream. And upstream was the direction that I went. But the notion of being open to possibilities that present themselves, I think that that's the thing that so many young people don't see. They don't see that it's possible to come out of some of these situations to a different place. And I think that this idea of helping to understand that if you strive and if you reach, let your let your reach be beyond what you perceive as your grasp, then in fact there are these opportunities. And at that point, you can begin to realize that there are possibilities that are out there that you never could have imagined because they don't exist now. We will grow into them.
Yeah.
Jim wants a brief redirect.
Thank you. Listening to my colleagues, especially Michael, and the comment that Shirley made, it makes me think of one thing that perhaps I would have told that younger person, that in this process of swimming upstream, be open to being mentored, because the number of mentors that will enter your life will far exceed the number that you will actually pick out. So you have to be open to the possibility. And so that's the one lesson that I would give to that cynical young man.
Okay, thank you. Before I raise the next question, I repeat the theme of this conference, which is toward justice, culture, language, and heritage in education, research, and practice, or praxis. I will ask each of the panelists to explain, to articulate how their work in STEM contributes to social justice. But before that, I'd like to share a brief synopsis of research that Michael and I have done. And obviously, I cannot name the universities. But we're interviewing the various underrepresented students in STEM fields in graduate education at several English universities, all in cities with 500,000 people or more. And if they're African Americans or Hispanic Americans there, we interview them as well. So one of the most phenomenal interviews that we had this past year, and that I've actually ever had in my entire life, was with a young African American man who was doing a PhD in astronomy at one of the universities in England. And we began to talk. He was an identical twin. His mother had him when she was 14 years of age. He had an older brother that had been born when she was 13. The identical twin brother is currently trying to finish his 2-year college degree. The twin whom we interviewed is doing a PhD at a literally renowned university. And I asked him, how did you get here? What kind of conditions were there? And what happened is he was adopted. And his adoptive parents had initially decided to only adopt him. And they did not want to separate the identical twins. So they agreed to adopt his brother as well. And the parents were very religious and very social conscious. They already had 5 children. But they said, we want to give back. We're also working, one of the mother was, in a school system. And before the term social justice was in vogue, they were actually engaging in it. And I found just absolutely phenomenal, considering too that this young man was not adopted until he began elementary school. And here he was at one of the world's premier universities and has already been offered a postdoctorate at one of the American premier universities. So, Shirley, if you would like to respond in terms of the themes of the conference in relation to STEM.
How does one get from wherever you start? I think that is a matter of seeking the harder road. And I know that sounds a little strange, but the harder the courses, the greater the challenge, the greater is the opportunity. And you don't get there by yourself. You have coaches, you have mentors, you have peers. And I think that this notion of finding and building or finding community is really a critical one. Most of the people who have been successful that I know, they have found community, or they have found people who would help them or encourage them. at particular points, critical points in time. And it only takes one or two people at the right time to keep you on the path. All of us have confronted that course where we almost failed, only to be pulled back when we had someone who was able to assist us. And I think that this notion of how do you create this kind of larger structure so that people don't fall between the cracks is really an important idea.
Thank you. Michael?
So I'll give a rather pragmatic answer, whereas Shirley's given a very moving answer, because I obviously work in STEM education. So the bit of the question I'll concentrate on is how does my own work try and improve things? So to do with the theme of the conference, try to contribute to justice. When I trained to be a teacher, I needed to have my eyes opened a lot, because in common with a lot of people who trained to be teachers, I just was not aware of the way in which having 25 to 30 young people in a room could control my behavior as a teacher. We did not evolve to manage groups of 25 to 30. You know, we evolved to be good in much smaller groups, and most people, unless they're exceptional, need to be taught. So to give a couple of totally obvious examples, all the research, not just in STEM education, but in education in general, shows that in many, many cultures, certainly in US and in Northern European culture, if a teacher doesn't concentrate, they end up both asking far more questions of boys relative to the number of boys they are, and accepting far more comments from the boys than from the girls. If you concentrate on it as a teacher, it's very easy to avoid. But when you get tired, it's what happens. And there's a huge amount of data that shows that over the course of a year, you end up having classrooms where 2/3 of the talk is boy talk, even if there are only 50% of the pupils. To give another trivial, well not trivial, but I mean very straightforward example once one says it, in most countries, and I'll speak for certainty about England, teachers come from middle-class backgrounds. So they're not representative on average of all their students. There are some wonderful exceptions. Middle-class language operates differently to language in other classes. It is terribly easy for middle-class teachers at the beginning of their careers to think that students are being rude or not paying attention, when they are in fact paying attention and they're not intentionally trying to be rude. And I was well taught, and basically it meant that I got taught, don't jump to conclusions. So in other words, just because somebody is speaking to you in a way that my mother would have been absolutely furious if I'd spoken to her like that, does not mean he or she is intending to undermine you, is not interested in the subject. That is in a way utterly routine teacher education, but it takes a bit of time to learn.
Thank you. Jim?
So there are several different cross-cutting ways I can answer this question. Unlike your last question, this one was an easy one for me. So I'm in my 43rd consecutive year in the classroom, and I'm trying to make it to 50 because I think I should be allowed to end my incarceration at that point. But teaching is an act of social justice, in my opinion, because the greatest thing that I can do for my students is to be a doorway through which they walk to realize their futures. And I have to be open to that possibility that I'm going to say something on a given day that, to my mind, might not be very important. But I'm sure that all of us as teachers have had this very strange experience where a student will come back to you and say, you said X on a given day, and you won't remember it, but the student will say, that was the most important thing I heard the entire school year. And if you're a teacher, you get this a lot. So the first part of social justice in my life is that I teach. And I'm an enthusiastic teacher. As I said, my 43rd consecutive year, I'm having a ball. And so I would recommend that those of us who love teaching remain passionate in that endeavor throughout our entire career, because it does so very much for our students. Another way in which, and I teach physics, so it's a STEM subject, but another way is the public policy that I serve, serving on I'm a member of the National Commission on Forensic Science. Many people don't know this, but the stories that you see on CSI or Hollywood, And the reality is that forensic science in our country is largely abysmal. So speaking with one of my colleagues last night on PCAST, and he gave me a story that reinforces this. So maybe a number of the members of the audience have heard that cases prosecuted by the FBI on the basis of quote unquote forensic evidence have been under the process of review. And there are some over 1,000 such cases. Of the first 290 cases that have been reviewed, 96% have been found to contain statements by forensic scientists made in court that are not based at all on any reproducible science.
Oops.
So working to get STEM so that we have justice for all, that's another thing that I do among my 4 careers.
Thanks. The next couple of questions are for Jim and for Michael, and first for Jim. You're the director of the Center for String and Particle Theory and the former director for terrestrial and extraterrestrial atmosphere at Maryland and at Howard University, where you have also discussed this work from these centers on National Public Radio, NOVA, and various other outlets in the United States, England, and Australia. What would you share with our audience today of university faculty, public policy makers, and doctoral students, and just a few highlights from these 2 centers?
Well, I don't want to turn this into a class on relativistic quantum field theory, first of all. So let me just say that in my own personal research, I am able to stand in front of young people and say, at age 64, I'm having more fun than when I was 18. And most individuals in life never get to say that truthfully, but my research allows me to say that about that component of my career, that I'm having more fun than I ever imagined. I'm inventing new mathematics. This is something else that puzzles people, that mathematics, like music, is an actual creation of the human mind, and I'm engaged in that constantly in my research career. But the more important message I would give to any academician is get out of the ivory tower in one's thinking. Get out of the ivory tower and reach out in as many possible venues as you can. And when the opportunity presents itself, get out of the ivory tower and talk about what it is that you're doing and how that relates to people's aspirations, to a society's aspirations, to the aspirations of the next generation, to aspirations of the underprivileged and underrepresented. Get out of the university and actually show some of what I think many of us are committed to doing.
Thank you. For Michael, you have a very interesting area, and I must say, in terms of the effect and research on various religious faiths and science. So you've engaged in considerable research on students who reject the theory of evolution for religious reasons. What would you share with our audience today in some of the highlights of what you found in your research?
Yeah, well, the backdrop to this, of course, is that England's very different to the US and a number of other countries. The US, in common with France and Turkey in particular, roughly speaking, as many of you will know better than I do, doesn't teach much about religious education at all in the public school system, unless it's directly relevant to bits of history or occasionally English literature. In England, from 1871 to 1989, the only compulsory subject we had was religious education. Now, it's not always taught very well, but there is some quite good evidence now building up showing that better religious education teaching in England is associated with lower levels of extremism among students. And this is a bit, I'm sorry, but it's not really to do with the evolution. I want to get on to your question, but it's just for me a rather important issue to do with the world we live in. The cynical reason for this is if you've sat through 11 years of mediocre teaching of religious education in England, as I, in common with everyone else, did, it's quite difficult to gear yourself up to be very extreme about religion, because it's been rather like being forced to learn about the geography of an area. But the more serious reason is it becomes more difficult to have only one very narrow way of understanding what a religion is. By the time you've had a teacher who's usually got a degree in theology or a degree in the humanities, if he or she's on theology, just talk you through what's meant by religion, the different manifestations of religion. You've plodded off in school groups to local synagogues and a local church, and if you've got one, a mosque or a temple, and you've written numerous essays, it just becomes part of life. So I'm quite positive about that. Now, much more briefly, evolution, you can probably imagine in terms of what I said about climate change, and I'm passionate about evolution. Of course, I'm an evolutionary biologist. I'm delighted, by the way, if students bring up objections to evolution in the science classroom, provided they're objections based within science. The science classroom is not the place for me or anybody else to start getting into the interpretation of Scripture. Very happy if somebody wants to ask me about my interpretation of, Genesis 1 to 3, but not in a science classroom. And I do that telling them it's because that's not how science works. We don't, in science, give authority to those sort of texts. But if somebody starts telling me that the speed of light has changed dramatically in the last few hundred years, and that's why the Earth is only 6,000 to 10,000 years old, I'm really happy to talk about that and ask the other students, well, how could we know if the speed of light has changed? What data could we collect? And similarly, arguments about, no missing fossils. What does that mean? How do we know if there are or not, and so on? And actually, it's not easy to do. That's the last thing to state. So most science teachers in England just do not go there. But a small number use this as a way of teaching science better.
Thank you, Michael. The next question is a continuation for Jim and for Michael. Before I crafted this question, I was actually watching Jim on YouTube, and he was talking about the relationship and the distinctiveness between faith, religion, and science. For our audience today, Michael, of course, has a PhD in science education, but Michael is also an Anglican priest and a professional counselor. So he wears a number of different hats. So for the two of you, Michael and Jim, what would you share, although you briefly started the response, Michael, what would you share between the two of you share on the relationships between science, faith, and religion?
Start?
I was going to let you start.
Okay, fine. So I'll just be yeah. I'll be brief because this is a huge topic, and I'll try and focus it on education because that's my particular interest. If you'd asked me 10 or certainly 15 years ago, I would have assumed in England that religion was just becoming slowly less and less important. I have been surprised at the way in which, simply in terms of the public debate, religion has gone upwards the last 15 years. And what that means is it's more of an issue in schools. And as I said earlier to the previous question, we need to find ways of dealing positively with religion in a way that neither causes some teachers to give the impression that if you don't have religious faith, you're wrong, but nor causes other teachers to give the impression that if you do have religious faith, chances are you're not going to be that interested in science, because obviously that's often not the case.
Jim?
So this is a complicated question, and one that, since I do a lot of public speaking on things like the Big Bang, the beginning of the universe, the evolution of the cosmos, before diverse audiences, it's a question that often arises at the end of a presentation where an audience member will say, well, do you believe that God created the universe, or do you believe that the Big Bang is correct? And I always answer that's the wrong question. Because you see, it's not that I believe that the Big Bang occurred, I have evidence. Science is first, last, and always about evidence. It's a little bit the way that jurisprudence in this country is practiced. Namely, if someone is taken into a court, you have a jury, and the jury decides guilt or innocence not on the basis of their beliefs, but on the evidence that's presented to them. It's the evidence that makes the argument. And so when I am engaged in these discussions, first of all, I try to make sure that the other person knows that I am respectful of their beliefs, and I think this is critical and something that we in the STEM disciplines really must practice very rigorously, that you do not disrespect people of deep faith who are questioning you about the interaction of religion, faith, and science. But the other thing that I try to do is remind people of things that perhaps they are not aware. So, for example, there was a biologist, an evolutionary biologist named Stephen Jay Gould, who wrote a series of works back in the 80s and 90s through the early 2000s. And one of the things a phrase that he coined was non-overlapping magisteria. He said that religion is a magisterium, that is, it's valid in its range of, its domain of operation, and that science is a magisterium, and that the two do not overlap. Now, this is something that, although Stephen phrased it this way, this is something that's actually been part of Western religious thought for over 1,000 years. And this actually surprises often to people of faith, because although people practice their faith by going to mosques, synagogues, churches, it is not often the case that these places are also where a believer learns about the evolution of their system of belief. St. Augustine of Hippo made some very interesting comments about the role of believers when confronted by scientific evidence. This is over 1,000 years old. And I'm not going to remember the exact quote, but effectively what he says is that it is an embarrassment for collections of believers to have some of them denigrate scientific beliefs on the basis of just how they essentially emotionally react to this. And this is an astounding statement, and yet it is so little known through most of Western societies, and certainly not almost completely unknown in communities of faith. And yet this has resided as part of the canon of the Catholic Church, and as I said, it's a stream of thought in Western religions that's over 1,000 years old. So Stephen Jay Gould's statement about non-overlapping magisteria is in fact a restatement of this 1,000-year-plus belief in Western religion. The fact that we don't know this, it's shame on us. And the final thing that I would say is, I've actually spent some time thinking about why this could be true. Why are these two magisterium overlapping? And I'm willing to talk to people offline. I've written essays on this. I think there's a mechanism actually at work that a scientist can identify.
Can I just comment very briefly? I don't get many people quoting Augustine, so I'm not going to pass up the opportunity. I mean, it's wonderful because it's in a book called On the Literal Interpretation of Genesis. That's the title of Augustine's book. Augustine, almost certainly the greatest theologian the Christian tradition has ever known. And he says exactly as Jim says. He says, do not talk nonsense when appearing to contradict the findings of rational people. And he then talks quite explicitly about how the earth is not just created in 6 days, the universe in 6 days, because if they hear you talking nonsense about such things, how will they believe you when you come to talk to them about, and then he gets on to baptism and the traditional teachings of the church. So this is somebody exactly said over 1,000 years ago, coming to the conclusion, you're not reading Genesis correctly if you think the world was created in 6 days. That's not the point of it. You know, snakes don't talk. We don't have to worry about who did Adam and Eve's children marry. Was it all incest? No, you've just honestly, this is Augustine, I'm paraphrasing now slightly, saying, wrong question, to use your phrase.
Thanks. The last question is for Shirley before we open it up for comments and remarks from the audience and questions. You were one of the women pioneers in environmental science and ecology in the 1960s, as I mentioned in your introduction. You've also been a member of the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women. And during the past 2 decades, 1995 to 2015, what have you observed in terms of the changing status of women in STEM, particularly in fields in the United States and in England, where they have been severely underrepresented? And how does an increase in the number of women in STEM improve daily lives?
I have been, you're right, I have been deeply involved in this issue for a very, very long time. As a matter of fact, I participated in actually organized a meeting in 1983 before the Nairobi Women's Conference, looking at the issue of science, technology, and women, a world perspective. And in that particular case, we looked at the lower numbers of women who were in STEM fields basically around the world. And since that time, we've seen really substantial growth in areas such as in the life sciences, for example, be that in the, as well as in medicine, for example, but not growth, but not really a lot of growth in areas such as mathematics and physics, Jim. Computer science has actually gone in the other direction. Women were 30-some% of those in receiving computer science degrees in the U.S. in 1985, and it's basically been going downhill ever since. And so I think that one of the things that we've begun to understand is that even though the overarching numbers go up, if we start looking at specific fields and subfields, you get a mixed picture. And you begin to understand that looking around the world as well, that we see more women in agriculture or in food-related areas and what have you, but not necessarily the growth in physics or in mathematics. That said, some countries are better than others for women in physics or women in mathematics, and I think that it behooves us to try to figure out what's different there that might be able to be applied in other places. So there's the women in issue, but I think that the most really important part is the science, technology, engineering for women. How do we use these fields to improve women's lives? I remind some of my colleagues who are working around the issues of energy and energy research that in most of the places in the world, energy is a woman's issue because it's about biomass and about biomass collection for use of energy. And that so when we have these conversations in our hallowed halls, make sure that we are thinking about this in a broader way. We have, for example, had the Millennium Development Goals, 15 years of those, and I think that the reason we didn't make as much progress as we could have or should have with regard to the Millennium Development Goals was that we had a goal about women, but we didn't have a focus on women in the rest of the goals. And if we, in fact, consider that water is a women's issue, that food security and nutrition is a women's issue, that the health of the family and the community is a women's issue. So while we are, in fact, out there articulating all of these kinds of development goals, we didn't do it while applying a gender lens to looking at those issues, not only in terms of the impact, but also in terms of women as actors to move those goals forward. I also serve as co-chair of the Gender Advisory Board of the UN Commission on Science and Technology for Development. And each year when the commission has met in Geneva, whatever the theme is, I come and give a presentation on applying a gender lens to whatever that theme is. And you'd be surprised at the things that get left off the table if you don't apply a gender lens. And that's not to say that it's only about women. Sometimes you don't apply the gender lens and it's affecting males. I would point out, for example, that in the Caribbean, if you look at education, you find females in schools.
Yep.
And so the question is, where are the males? So it is important that we begin to understand that STEM is absolutely critical to the long-term health and prosperity of this country, and of the world. But we've got to look at it in a gendered way, because that's the way it basically plays out. We have different roles within the family and community in most places in the world, and that those things are manifestly different in terms of the way that they operate. These are core social justice concerns, that not every act has the same impact on the different groups. And in this particular case, because of the gendered roles, then we have gendered impact. And so therefore, we really have to look at this not only in terms of the practical concerns, but also in terms of the policy concerns.
Okay, thank you. We could certainly ask more questions of our panelists, but we'll open it up now for you. There's a microphone right by the gentleman in the center with the camera. So if you will come over to the microphone and identify yourself, your organization, and a brief question or comment.
Okay, my name is Karen Mafundikwa. I'm a filmmaker, and so my film showed here today. I have a question, though. My niece is, I'm in Jamaica, but my niece is an immigrant to the U.S., and she lives in Florida. She just started college. Now, she's been in the top 3 percentile of her state in math and science ever since she got here, from she was 13 years old, and now she's entered college. And she went because she wanted to be a research scientist. She wanted to create drugs and, discover new medicine. And she gets to college, and then the advisor tells her, oh, you could be a pharmacist. And I just think, where does this come from? You have a kid who's done so well in science. She's doing well in college. She's very mature. It's not that she can't manage. What would you suggest for, I don't know, people who encounter that kind of challenge? Because that just seems to be a gap where the people who would be advising youth are turning them off into, a pharmacist. I just think, she's capable of so much more.
Jim or Shirley, since it was about the U.S.?
Ladies first.
No, Jim.
Can I try?
Yes, Michael has a comment.
It's about how we train people who give careers, information,
Yeah.
advice, and guidance. I agree with you entirely. We have it just the same in England. Some of the most gendered practices are the stereotypical assumptions of quite powerful people who give advice about careers. And of course, the reason is they have a very short training. And it goes exactly back to where I was talking earlier on, that when I was trained as a teacher, I had 120 days in my year in higher education, which included passionate teaching from sociologists, psychologists, historians, economists, about the way in which, if one was not careful, all that education did was to perpetuate the present system. And I was fascinated by it, because I'm ashamed to say I had not very much thought of it beforehand. And I don't know the details of careers, education, advice in your particular state, but I doubt it's as thorough as it should be.
Yeah, let me just say that when I was, the thing that really bothers me is that is happening now, and it happened when I was in school, and I'm 68 years old, so the idea that you can still get this kind of gendered advice is really troubling. But it happens for all different kinds of groups, that people make the assumption that they are held in place by the stereotype. And so they make the assumption that if people are one way, if they're poor, if they're if they're a minority, if they're female. So I do think that more training is actually needed, and that's really, but even at that, you may not get a change. So as far as I'm concerned, people need alternative sources of information about these things.
Certainly so, and if I may give a personal example, I have siblings. One of my brothers is a medical doctor, and my sister is an RN. And when they were both undergraduates, only a year apart, they were basically taking the same undergraduate courses in biology, chemistry, physics, anatomy. My sister earned a Bachelor's of Science in Nursing and then did graduate work and became a nurse practitioner, specialist in oncology. My brother became a physician, and he still is, and went to Harvard, but they often joke about the fact that they literally had the same undergraduate education. Obviously, there were some course differences, but we joke that my sister should have been the physician. We have another question, I think, behind you.
May I respond to that one?
Yes, please.
Thank you. So I am the father of a set of twins, a boy and a girl. They will be starting graduate school this coming fall. My son is a biology major, and so he will be pursuing a graduate program in biology. My daughter is a physics major, and so she will be pursuing a graduate program in physics. And so through the lens of especially my daughter, I have watched how the current version of our education system works for young women who initially start off with an interest in the sciences. In my daughter's case, she first enunciated an interest in physics when she was in 9th grade. So, we have now data, because, we scientists are data-driven, so we have data that, anecdotal, I agree, but it's consistent with what we hear over and over for large numbers of young women. So my daughter encountered situations like that, but clearly it made no difference, and it goes back to something that is incumbent upon all of us, and something I alluded to in the first set of comments I made. Namely, family is critical in preparing their young people to deal with the world as it is, not as we would like it to be, but as it is. And so it is incumbent on mothers and fathers of young women, of young people of color, to speak the truth about what these young people are likely to encounter, and not to have a fantasy which describes the state of our nation. We didn't do that for our children. We didn't say, oh, woe is me, the sky is falling, and there's no possibility, because that's the wrong message also. But we also didn't say this is the yellow brick road and you're off to the Emerald City, because that's also not true. Tell the truth. Tell the young people the truth. This is the most empowering thing that you can do.
Okay, I think the person behind you in the, looks like a teal blouse, but I can't see with the lights. Go ahead, please.
My name is Eliza Stein. I'm at Northwestern University. And I think back to what you guys were saying in the beginning of the conversation about how the important thing is not to have there be more PhDs necessarily in physics or math or whatever STEM subject, but it's important that every person in our educational society comes out feeling confident in STEM subjects and capable of reasoning and having evidence-based arguments. But I mapped that onto the issue of the cost of higher education and just getting an undergraduate degree in STEM. And I know that a lot of people argue that maybe we should change our K through 12 system so that not everyone needs a college education. As long as you come out of the K through 12 system with a strong enough background in STEM to be able to think critically, then it's not as important to get a bachelor's degree, especially because it's so expensive. And I sort of wanted to hear what the panel thought about that argument or other arguments that have to do with the cost of higher education.
May I take the lead there?
Sure.
Because this is what I've lived and breathed for the last 6 years in my public policy hat. So there are lots of confusing messages out there. For example, one of them is that a lot of people think that President Obama says everybody should get a 4-year education. He doesn't say that. If you actually look at his speech, that's not what he's saying at all. If you will look, you'll see, for example, that This president has been a big supporter of two-year community colleges as a doorway for people to get the access to skills that they will need to survive and thrive in this new economy. So it is true that you see, our country is a very interesting thing, like most countries, obviously. But our country, if you look at its economic trajectory for going back 30 years, we kind of disconnected the middle class from basically wealth creation about 30 years ago. The statistics are there to kind of show that. Now, what that has meant is that the way that the economy will grow in the future, which we can kind of see, it's going to be about, as Shirley said, it's going to be about innovation, it's going to be about entrepreneurship, it's going to be about a different mode of creating wealth. And this different mode doesn't say everybody has to be a scientist, but it does demand precisely what you said, that people be able to reason from evidence-based arguments, that they be able to take in data and draw valid conclusions, that they also have a flexibility in terms of cognitive ability for change. These are not necessarily things that our educational system has had to deliver up until this point, but here in this nation, if we don't figure out how to do this, the American dream is simply going to die. It's that simple.
Did either of you have a brief comment?
I have a brief comment, and that is that Jim is absolutely right. I want, however, to point out that when people are making choices, for example, about fields and things like this, they often don't look at kind of like what is the long-term impact on those. If you choose to stop before you really have finished, there can be a long-term impact. STEM fields are among the most beneficial in terms of providing income parity for women, for example. You have less difference within the STEM fields than you do in many other areas. You have more opportunity. When there were high levels of unemployment, the unemployment rates were lower for people with STEM skills, even though they were still higher than they usually were. They were lower if you had STEM preparation than if you did not. And it has often been the case that those of us who are minority or women, we know that we have had to have more training and more credentials to get hired and promoted than others. We have to demonstrate that we have the preparation, and for many other groups, it's just assumed. And I think that's a part of that reality that Jim is talking about. And I do think that the more credentialing, and people are starting to understand that now, that you may need more credentialing in order to be employed.
And allied to Shirley's point, in England, the amount of extra money you get from a degree is greater if you're female than if you're male. And it's almost certainly for exactly that reason. If you are female, it's going to take a long time, if you haven't got a degree, to get an annual income of more than $25,000 if you ever get it. For men, it's easier without a degree to get a middle-class income.
What I write about, and I refer to it as the legitimacy of roles, particular roles for men, for women, and then by various demographic groups. I think I saw a final question for this lady here who's walking toward the mic, and we're just about out of time now.
All right, well, it's a bit of a hard question, but hopefully you can answer it quickly. So I work with the National League of Cities. We work with municipals, mayors, and one of the elements that I hear throughout this conversation is a lot on family values, making sure that there's a persistence in students, being honest with students, so on and so forth. I wanted to just direct the question a little bit more around system change, because I feel like we've talked a lot about more of this intimate family change. And it's a bit of a chicken and an egg question. when we're thinking about systems and we're thinking about disadvantaged youth, low income, so on and so forth, what do you guys feel is the pivotal system to attack first?
Yep.
They're all important, right? We know we need changes in our education system, we need changes in the way that we view these students, so on and so forth. But what do you feel is the most imperative system?
Let me make a few initial comments, and I'm doing this because the light is literally two bright lights right over me. From a social science perspective, from a sociological perspective, there are basic social institutions in every society: the family, religion, governance, schools. They are all very important. The salience of the importance depends also on what level of education we're talking about. Because obviously, if we're talking about 5- and 6-year-olds, the family is so important. The primary school teachers are so important. As we move up into additional levels, the structure of higher educational institutions that permits or doesn't permit a certain level of mobility is really important. For example, and I, again, having spent so much time recently in England, the level of mobility, once you get into what is called post-high school or post-secondary education, becomes fairly limited. We have 2-year colleges here, and then you can, if you do reasonably well, as President Obama and others have pointed out, you have a chance to go and earn a degree. However, and this is what our research is showing, once you start talking about being within the university or the postgraduate level, those structural factors in the university, from the teachers, the First Lady asked about counseling and career advice, those become so important. It doesn't mean that the family's not important. It doesn't mean that the high school curriculum wasn't important. But at different levels and different times, it becomes a difference in terms of which are more salient. Now, obviously, if someone is doing a PhD in chemistry or a PhD in sociology or economy, whatever field, hopefully they have hopefully they have a stable domestic life, which becomes important. But at the same time, if there's no financial aid through a graduate assistantship or research assistantship, those become very important. And if they're ending up working 40 hours a week and still trying to take 3 courses every semester, it's very difficult.
So very briefly, the best data come from these meta-analyses, and they're to do with student attainment rather than specifically with reducing inequality, but they show with absolute clarity in all countries that the big changes that most politicians like to make to things like the structure of schooling, so in the US, whether you have charter schools or not, in my country, whether we have free schools, things like busing children between schools, are always an order of magnitude less important than changes to pedagogy. This is incredibly encouraging because changes to pedagogy cost themselves a fraction of structural changes. It is honestly true. It is the teachers in the classroom that are by far the most important outcome on student attainment, whether you are talking about wealthy countries like on average the US and the UK, or so-called developing countries.
Well, thank all of you for coming to our presidential panel, where we had 3 very eminent scientists speaking to us, and our panel was from classrooms to outer space via public policies, renowned intellectuals and leaders who articulate opportunities and challenges. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.